The night Damon Ashbourne pointed at her across a room full of 1,000 witnesses and said, "You don't belong here, you never did." Elena Vale didn't cry. She didn't argue. She didn't even raise her voice. She set down her glass of sparkling water, smoothed the front of her dress, the one she'd saved 3 months to buy, and walked out of that gala with her spine straight and her jaw locked so tight her back teeth ached. That was the moment. Not when she lost her father. Not when the firm let her go. Not even when she found out the truth about what happened to her family. It was that moment standing in front of Manhattan's most powerful people while a man who had never worked a real day in his life called her nobody, that something shifted inside Elena Vale. Something cold and quiet and absolutely certain. She would remember that night. She would make sure he did, too. If someone had treated you like that, stripped you down to nothing in front of everyone who mattered, what would you have done? Most people would have walked away and never come back. Elena Vale came back, just not the way anyone expected. Before we get into what happened next, and trust me, you are not ready for where this story goes, if you're watching this right now, subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Drop your city and country in the comments so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. New stories like this one go up every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. Now let's get into it. The Ashbourne Foundation Gala was the kind of event that made people feel small on purpose. That was the whole point, whether anyone admitted it or not. The venue, a converted Beaux-Arts building in Midtown that had once been a bank, was lit the way museums light their most prized collections. Amber and gold and carefully angled so that every surface glowed and every shadow fell exactly where someone wanted it. The guest list had been curated over 6 months. The wine had been selected by someone whose entire job was selecting wine. Even the floral arrangements cost more than Elena's monthly rent, and she knew that because she'd once been hired to design the renovation of the florist's shop and had seen the invoice sitting on the counter. Elena didn't belong in rooms like this. She knew that. She'd always known that. But knowing something and accepting it are two entirely different things, and Elena Vale had spent 3 to 4 years refusing to accept the version of herself that other people kept trying to hand her. She was there that night because of a project. 3 years of work compressed into a proposal that could save the Callaway Street neighborhood from demolition. 42 blocks of pre-war buildings, working-class storefronts, community gardens that elderly residents had been tending since before Elena was born. The Ashbourne Group had purchased the land 18 months ago. Their plans called for luxury towers and a boutique hotel, and something called a lifestyle retail corridor that Elena had stared at in the architectural renderings until the words stopped making sense. She had submitted her counter-proposal through every proper channel. She had written letters. She had attended public hearings where she was given exactly 4 minutes at a microphone before the moderator cut her off. She had collected 311 signatures from residents whose families had lived in that neighborhood for generations. None of it had moved the needle a single inch. So she had done something she'd never done before. She had called in a favor from a colleague who knew someone who knew the event coordinator, and she had gotten herself a seat at the Ashbourne Foundation Gala. Not a prime seat. Not anywhere near the front tables where the real decisions got made. But a seat. A legitimate invitation with her name on it, and a 30-second window she planned to use if she could just get close enough to the right person. She had not planned on running into Damon Ashbourne first. She should have. Looking back, she understood exactly how naive that was. But she had spent so long trying to do things the right way, the professional way, the respectful way, that she'd convinced herself that doing it right would protect her from whatever came next. It didn't. Damon Ashbourne was 38 years old, the eldest child of the family's public face, and the man most likely to control the Ashbourne Group within the next decade. He was tall, well-built in the way that expensive personal trainers produced, and had the particular brand of confidence that comes not from accomplishment, but from never once having been told no by someone who mattered. He wore his suits like armor. He moved through rooms like he owned them, which in many cases he did. Elena spotted him near the bar around 9:15. She didn't approach immediately. She watched him work the room for a few minutes, noting how he shifted his body depending on who he was talking to, warmer with money, dismissive with anyone he couldn't use. She had seen men like him her whole career. She knew how to read them. What she hadn't accounted for was that he'd already noticed her. Not in any meaningful way. Not because she stood out or because he recognized her from the proposal filings or because he had any interest whatsoever in what she had to say. He noticed the way a person notices something slightly out of place in a room they consider theirs. A chair at the wrong angle, a glass left on the wrong surface. She was the thing that didn't belong, and he clocked her immediately. Elena crossed the room and introduced herself. She kept it simple. Her name, her firm, a single line about the Calloway Street proposal. She held out her hand. Damon looked at it for a moment before shaking it. The pause was deliberate. She felt it in her stomach but kept her face neutral. Elena Vale, he repeated, like he was checking whether the name was real. The heritage preservation woman. Architectural designer, she said. And yes, I submitted the counter-proposal on the Calloway development. I was hoping to get 5 minutes with someone on your acquisitions team. We have a process for that. I've used your process. I've used it repeatedly. I'm here tonight because your process hasn't produced a conversation. Something shifted in his expression. Not anger, not yet, but the particular kind of attention a man pays when he's decided he's going to enjoy making something difficult for someone. Right, the petition woman. The proposal covered adaptive reuse of existing structures, phased mixed-income development, and preservation of... I know what it covered. He picked up his drink from the bar. We've reviewed it. And it doesn't pencil out. He said it the way people say things when the conversation is already over in their head. The math doesn't work. The return timeline doesn't work. The community engagement component alone adds 18 months to a project that's already been delayed. The community engagement component is the point. He looked at her, then really looked at her, in a way that was less about seeing her and more about placing her. Figuring out her category. Who invited you tonight? The question landed like a hand on her shoulder, pushing down. I received an invitation, Elena said. Through whom? That's not really relevant to the... It's relevant to me. He wasn't raising his voice. He didn't have to. Around them, 2 or 3 nearby conversations had gone quiet in the particular way conversations go quiet when something interesting is about to happen. These events are by invitation from the Foundation's board. You're not on the donor list? You're not affiliated with any of our partner organizations, and you're... He paused, as if choosing the word carefully. Firm isn't exactly in our tier. Elena felt her face go warm, not from embarrassment, from the very specific effort of keeping her voice steady. My firm designed 3 award-winning community projects in the last 4 years and submitted a proposal that 42 community stakeholders signed off on. I'm here because no one at your organization has been willing to have an actual conversation. Because there isn't one to have. He set his glass down. Look, I'm going to be honest with you, because I think you're the kind of person who doesn't respond well to being managed. You worked hard on that proposal, it shows. The documentation is thorough. But this project is already decided. The permits are filed, the financing is structured, and the timeline is locked. Nothing you put in front of me tonight changes any of that. Then why did your father build a foundation, if not to have conversations like this one? That was the wrong thing to say. She knew at the instant it left her mouth, not because it was untrue, but because of what it did to his face. The openness closed. Whatever small thread of professional tolerance he'd been extending snapped clean through. He straightened up, and in the half-second before he spoke, Elena recognized what was coming the way you recognize the drop in air pressure before a storm. My father built this foundation, Damon said, and his voice had dropped into something quiet and precise to support initiatives by people with the expertise and the standing to execute them. Not he gestured at her, one small dismissive motion of his hand. People who show up to events they weren't properly invited to, lobbying for projects that don't have the financial basis to exist. Around them, the quiet had spread. There were now at least a dozen people in earshot, and none of them were pretending not to listen. Elena said, I was properly invited. You were facilitated. He said the word like it explained everything. And in that room, to those people, maybe it did. There's a difference, and I think you know that. He picked up his glass again. You're talented, Ms. Vale. Your work is genuinely interesting. But this room, these people, this isn't your world. The Calloway Street project isn't going to save whatever it is you're hoping it saves, and it is certainly not going to be the thing that puts you in the same conversation as the people in this room. So do yourself a favor. His eyes held hers flat and certain. Know your place. Go home. Let people who understand how this actually works make the decisions that need to be made. He turned away. Elena stood there 12 seconds. She counted them later, replaying the moment in her apartment at 2 in the morning. 12 seconds of standing in the middle of that room, surrounded by the quietest version of humiliation she had ever experienced. Not screaming, not cruel, just precise and deliberate and absolute. Then she set down her glass of sparkling water, smoothed the front of her dress, and walked out. She did not look back at Damon Ashbourne. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her face. What she couldn't know, what no one in that room could have known, was that a man standing at the far edge of the crowd had watched every second of it. He was older than most of the guests, probably 60, maybe a few years past it, with gray at his temples, and the kind of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades learning how not to react. He wore a dark suit with no tie, which in that room was its own statement. He held a glass of water, no alcohol, and he had not moved from his spot near the east wall for the better part of an hour. His name was Victor Ashbourne, Damon's uncle, and the most dangerous man in the family by a margin that no one on the outside would have guessed. Victor had built his wealth separately from the family's main empire quietly, over 30 years, through a combination of private equity property and a series of international investments that very few people knew the full scope of. He was not on the foundation's board. He did not attend these events as a rule. He had come tonight because something had been bothering him for 6 months, and he had wanted to look at his nephew's face in person and see if what he suspected was true. He had confirmed it about 40 minutes in. Now he watched Elena Vale pick up her bag from the coat check and walk toward the exit, and he made a decision. He caught up with her just outside the main entrance, on the wide marble steps that led down to the street. The city was loud below them, taxis and wind, and the low rumble of the subway somewhere underground, and Elena had her coat half on and her phone in her hand, and she was doing that thing people do when they're holding themselves together by sheer force of will, and they need about 60 more seconds before they can afford to feel anything. "Miss Vale," he said. She turned. Her expression was prepared for a lot of things. Pity, maybe. Another conversation that went nowhere. A reporter or a photographer or someone who wanted to make sure she knew what had just happened. She was not prepared for what he actually said. "I read your Calloway Street proposal," Victor told her. All of it, both versions. Elena stared at him. "I'm sorry, who are you?" Victor Ashbourne. He watched her process that, watched her file it, recalibrate. "I have no involvement in the foundation or the acquisitions division. I want to be clear about that up front." "Then why?" "Because I have been looking for someone with your specific skill set for about 8 months, he said. "And I wasn't expecting to find her here tonight, but here we are." He reached into his jacket and produced a card. Plain white. "Just a name and a number. I'd like you to call me. Not tomorrow, whenever you're ready. Take a week if you need it. But I'd like to have a conversation." Elena took the card. She looked at it. She looked at him. "About what?" she asked. Victor glanced back toward the gala doors, then at the street below. "About your father," he said, "and a few things that I think you deserve to know." Elena's hand tightened on the card. "What do you know about my father?" "More than I should," Victor said. And then quietly, "He trusted me with something before he died. I've been waiting for the right moment to do something with it. I think that moment might be now." He nodded to her once. "Take care of yourself tonight, Miss Vale. Call me when you're ready." He went back inside. Elena stood on those marble steps for a long time, the city moving all around her, the card in her hand, and the feeling sitting in her chest like a stone dropped into deep water. Her father had been dead for 4 years. She had spent those 4 years trying to make sense of a death that the official records called an accident, but that had never once felt like one. She called Victor Ashbourne 3 days later. The restaurant he chose was not what she expected. A narrow Italian place in the West Village, old enough that the booths were worn smooth. The kind of place where nobody important went because it wasn't impressive enough, and nobody unimportant went because it wasn't cheap enough. The exact midpoint of invisible. Victor was already there when she arrived. Coffee in front of him, menu closed, reading nothing. Waiting with the patience of a man who had done a great deal of waiting in his life. Elena sat down across from him and didn't bother with pleasantries. "You said you knew my father." "I did." "How?" "He worked for the Ashbourne Group for 11 years, Victor said. Financial investigator, forensic accounting specialty. He was brought in initially to clean up some irregularities in the international portfolio work that should have taken 18 months. He stayed 11 years because he was very good at what he did, and Victor paused, chose his words carefully, because he kept finding things. Elena felt the familiar tightening in her chest. What kind of things? Money. Moving through places it shouldn't move through. Accounts that existed in the filings but not in the operations. Property transfers that didn't correspond to any transaction in the ledger. Victor wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Your father was meticulous. He documented everything. He brought what he found to me because he didn't trust anyone else inside the family structure, and because I had a history of being another pause, willing to see things other people in my family chose not to see. What did you do with it? I tried to build a case, Victor said simply. We were working together toward something that would have exposed the full scope of what was happening. Financial crimes of a significant scale, fraud, potentially worse. He met her eyes. Then your father died, and everything he had collected disappeared. The restaurant noise, silverware, low voices. An espresso machine felt very far away. It wasn't an accident, Elena said. It wasn't a question. I don't know that, Victor said. I want to be very careful here because I genuinely do not know. What I know is that the timing was, he exhaled, not a coincidence. And I know that what he was documenting was serious enough that people with serious resources would have had serious reasons to want it stopped. Elena's hands were flat on the table. She was keeping them flat deliberately. And the evidence he collected? Most of it is gone. I assume destroyed. Victor looked at her, but not all of it. What does that mean? Before he died, your father gave me a partial archive. Documents, transaction records, some correspondence. It's enough to establish the shape of what was happening, but not enough to prove it conclusively. There are pieces missing. He paused. He told me he was keeping the most critical material somewhere else. Somewhere safe. He said he would come back to me with it when he was ready. He never got the chance. The silence between them stretched out. Elena said slowly. After he died. In his personal effects. Just a small metal keynote label, no note, nothing to indicate what it opened. I assumed it was a lockbox or a filing cabinet somewhere that I never found. She felt something cold moving up her spine. You think that's it, I think? Victor said carefully. That he may have left you more than a key. I think he may have left you everything he had left to give. Elena looked at the man across the table, tried to read him. Tried to measure whether this was real, whether this was manipulation, whether this was just another version of powerful people using her for something she couldn't see yet. Why do you want to open this now, she asked. Why after 4 years? Why not right after he died? Because I was afraid, Victor said, and the plainness of it, no hedging, no softening landed harder than any elaborate explanation would have. And because I was trying to figure out who I could trust. And because he looked past her for a moment, toward the door, because what I saw at that gala 3 days ago made me understand that waiting any longer means more people get hurt by something that should have been stopped a decade ago. What did you see at the gala? Victor looked back at her. I saw my nephew make a good person feel like nothing in front of a room full of people. And I've seen him learn that from the best. The weight of that settled. What exactly are you proposing, Elena asked. A partnership. Victor was very clear about it. Very deliberate. Legal, documented, formal. I have resources, access, and standing inside the family structure that you don't have. You have the key, and you may have your father's trust in a form we haven't uncovered yet. Together, we have a chance of finishing what he started. And what do you get out of it? The chance to do the one thing I should have done 4 years ago, he said. And whatever's left of a clean conscience after that. Elena sat with it, turned it over, looked for the angle she was missing. This is going to be dangerous, she said. Yes. You're asking me to walk into a family that already doesn't respect me and start pulling at things that got my father killed. Yes. He didn't flinch from it. She respected that. I won't pretend otherwise. Then why would I do this as your employee or your partner or whatever arrangement you're imagining? She kept her voice level. What protection does that give me that I don't already have? Victor looked at her for a long moment. What if it wasn't a professional arrangement? He said. Elena went very still. I'm not suggesting he started. Then what are you suggesting? He chose his next words, the way a man chooses words when he has thought about them for a long time and knows that saying them out loud changes everything. Your father trusted me more than anyone in that family ever has. That trust cost him everything. I have been carrying that for 4 years, and I am 61 years old, and I am tired of carrying it alone." He held her gaze. "I'm proposing a marriage, legal and real, an agreement between two people who both want the same thing, for reasons that are not romantic and do not need to pretend to be. I can give you legal, standing inside the family structure, access to records, to the estate, to rooms that would otherwise be closed to you. You would be protected because you would be family, and whatever else the Ashbournes are, they do not move openly against their own." Elena stared at him. "You're serious, completely. You understand how this sounds, I do." A muscle moved in his jaw. "I also understand that I'm asking you to take a significant risk based on the word of a man you met 4 days ago. I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I'm asking you to think about whether what you've been trying to do for 4 years alone, through proper channels, getting nowhere is working, and whether there might be a better way." Elena thought about the gala, about Damon's face, about the 42 blocks of Calloway Street, and the 311 signatures, and the 4 minutes at the microphone, and the word nobody landing in the middle of a room full of witnesses. She thought about her father, his voice on the phone 3 weeks before he died, telling her that he was close to something, that he couldn't say more yet, but that she should know he was close. She thought about the key, still in her jewelry box at home, the one she'd never been able to place. "Give me 2 weeks, she told Victor Ashbourne. He nodded. She called him back in 10 days. The wedding was small. A courthouse in the city, 2 witnesses, neither of them knew well. A lunch afterward at the same Italian restaurant, where they'd had their first real conversation. Elena wore a dress she already owned. Victor wore the same dark suit without a tie. They shook hands with the officiant and signed the papers, and walked out into an October afternoon that was cold enough for breath to show. She was 34. He was 61. She had not told anyone. Not her closest friend, not her colleague who'd gotten her into the gala, not her mother, who lived in Phoenix now and called every Sunday and asked about work, and did not know that her daughter's life had just changed direction so sharply that it barely resembled the same road anymore. She told no one because she needed the element of surprise, and because she understood, with the particular intelligence that comes from growing up without much money in rooms where everyone else had plenty. That surprise was one of the few advantages available to people like her. She was going to need every advantage she had, because 3 days later, Victor called the Ashbourne family's head of estate administration and informed him that he had married, and that his wife would be moving into Ashbourne House. The sound the phone made when Damon's assistant dropped it. On the other end was, Victor said later, almost worth everything that came after. Almost. The first time Elena walked through the doors of Ashbourne House, she was wearing her good coat and carrying a single suitcase, and she felt approximately as welcome as a fuse lit at the base of a building. The house was enormous in the way that old American money manifests enormousness, not flashy, not modern, but heavy and deliberate, like every wall had been built to remind visitors that the people inside had been important for a very long time. Dark wood paneling, high ceilings, paintings that were probably valuable, hanging in places that suggested they were being hidden as much as displayed. It smelled like old leather and the particular brand of cleaning products that very expensive houses use. The family had assembled, or some of them had. Claudia Ashbourne, Damon's mother, Gerald's wife, the woman who had spent 40 years managing the Ashbourne family's social presentation with the intensity of a general managing a campaign, was standing in the entrance hall when Elena walked in. She was 67, thin, perfectly dressed, with the kind of posture that communicated displeasure more clearly than any words. She looked at Elena. She looked at Victor. She looked at the suitcase. "You're serious," she said to Victor. "I am," Victor said. Claudia turned to Elena. The examination she conducted was thorough and took about 4 seconds. "How long have you known each other?" "Long enough," Victor said. Victor Claudia. His voice was quiet, but it was a wall. "This is my home too. Elena is my wife. I expect her to be treated accordingly." The silence in the entrance hall was the kind that has weight. Elena stood inside it and did not apologize for being there. Claudia turned and walked away without another word. That was the beginning. Damon showed up 4 hours later. He came in through the side entrance. Elena had already learned that the family used the side entrance. The main door was essentially theater, and he stopped when he came into the kitchen and found Elena at the counter with a cup of coffee and a set of architectural drawings spread out in front of her. He stared at her. She looked up. "Hi," she said. His face went through 3 different things in about 2 seconds. Recognition. Disbelief. Something that wanted to be anger but hadn't landed there yet. "What are you doing here?" "I live here," Elena said. "As of yesterday." He stared at her. "What does he stopped?" Started again. "Victor, your uncle, yes. You married—" He couldn't seem to finish the sentence. He tried twice. "You actually— How long have you even—" The ceremony was Thursday. She picked up her coffee. "I know this is a surprise. A surprise." He said it like the word had broken in his mouth. "You show up at our foundation gala uninvited. I send you home, and then you—" He stopped himself again, visibly. She watched him work to get control of his face and mostly succeed. "What's the play here, Miss Vale?" "No play," she said. "Your uncle and I got married. It's legal and it's registered, and I have no interest in your opinion of it." "He's 61 years old, I know." "You're, what, 34? 34, yes." Damon crossed his arms. "And you expect me to believe this isn't about money." Elena set down her coffee cup with enough care that it made the deliberateness obvious. "I don't expect you to believe anything, Damon. I'm not asking for your approval. I'm telling you how things are. Victor and I are married. I'm here. Appreciate." And I would held his gaze if we could manage to be adults about it. "You called me Damon. That is your name. People in this house call you Mr. Ashbourne?" She didn't let herself smile. "I'm family now. I'll call you Damon." He stood there for a long moment. She could see him recalibrating, trying to find the angle, the read, the category to put her in. She'd watched him do it at the gala. He was doing it again now. The difference was that now she had more information about him than he had about her, and she intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. "We'll see how long this lasts," he said finally. "I imagine we will," Elena said. He left the kitchen. Elena turned back to her drawings. Her hands were steady. Her heart was doing something complicated behind her ribs that she chose not to examine too carefully. She was inside the house. She was family in the legal sense of the word. And somewhere in this building, or in a vault she hadn't found yet, a small metal key and 27 years of her father's work were waiting for her to finish what he had started. She picked up her pencil. She got to work. The first week inside Ashbourne House taught Elena 3 things. The first, the family operated on a system of silences. Not comfortable silences, not the kind that existed between people who knew each other well enough not to need words. These were loaded silences, the kind deployed as weapons, designed to make a person feel the weight of being unwelcome without anyone having to say it outright. Claudia was a master of it. She could walk into a room Elena was sitting in, acknowledge every other person present, and walk back out without her eyes landing on Elena once. It was a performance that required practice. Elena recognized the effort it took, which meant she recognized the fear underneath it. The second thing, Victor was more isolated inside this family than she had understood when she agreed to this. His relationships with his brother Gerald and with Damon were functional at best. The surface politeness of people who shared a name and an inheritance and very little else. He had his own wing of the house, his own staff, his own schedule. The family treated him like a tolerated eccentric, which told Elena something important: they underestimated him. They always had, and they had no idea what he'd been building, quietly for the past 4 years. The third thing Elena learned that first week, someone in Ashbourne House was watching her. Not Damon. His surveillance was obvious, almost lazy in its transparency. He would appear in doorways when she was working, ask pointed questions dressed up as casual conversation, and occasionally leave financial publications face up on surfaces she regularly passed, as if the sight of numbers she wasn't supposed to understand might rattle her. It was amateur. She filed it under things that didn't require her energy. This was different. It was subtler. A member of the household staff who found reasons to be in adjacent rooms. A door to the east corridor that she found ajar twice, in the same position, in the early morning when no one should have been in that part of the house. Her laptop moved 3 millimeters from where she'd left it on the writing desk. She'd started placing a tiny pencil mark at the edge, a habit her father had taught her when she was 12, when he was already the kind of man who thought about such things. Someone was looking for something. Whether they were looking for what she was looking for, or whether they were looking for evidence of what she knew, she couldn't determine yet. She told Victor on the 8th day. He listened without interrupting, which she'd learned was his default mode full still, patient attention that made most people feel heard, and occasionally made Elena feel like she was being studied. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "It's probably Marcus," he said. "Who's Marcus?" "Head of Household Security. He reports to Gerald directly, not through the estate administration." Victor folded his hands on his desk. "Gerald has been using him for personal security management for about 6 years. What that means in practice is that Marcus keeps track of who's in the house and what they're doing and reports back. Your brother has someone surveilling his own house guests." "His own family members," Victor said, and the slight emphasis on family wasn't lost on her. "Yes, he has for years. Most of them have either figured it out and decided not to care, or haven't figured it out at all." He looked at her. "The fact that you noticed in 8 days is—" He paused. "Not surprising to me, but it would be surprising to Gerald." "Should I be worried?" Victor considered it genuinely, which she appreciated. He didn't reassure her reflexively. "Not yet. At this stage, Gerald is trying to assess what you are, whether you're a problem. His instinct will be to gather information before he acts, because that's how he operates." But he held her gaze. "The moment he thinks you're a threat rather than a nuisance, the calculation changes." "How long do we have before that happens?" "Depends on what we find," Victor said. "And how quickly?" Elena nodded. She pulled out the key, the small metal key she'd carried in the inner pocket of her bag every day for 4 years, so habitual that she no longer noticed the weight of it, and set it on the desk between them. Victor looked at it for a long time without touching it. "Your father gave it to me with very specific instructions," he said finally. "He said the lock it fit was inside the house. Not in a bank, not in an office. Here." He looked up. "I've spent 4 years trying to find it without drawing attention. The East Wing's basement storage is the most likely candidate. There's a section of it that was sealed off during a renovation about 15 years ago that's never been fully reopened. Gerald claims it's structural. I've never believed that." "Then that's where we start," Elena said. She reached across the desk and picked the key back up. Put it in her pocket. "Tomorrow night," she said, "Gerald's dinner with the acquisitions board runs until at least 10. Show me how to get to the East Wing without going through the main corridor." Victor looked at her with some that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite concern. Some precise combination of both that she was starting to recognize as his version of respect. "You're not what I expected," he said. "Nobody ever is," Elena said. And she left it at that. She didn't make it to the East Wing the next night. Damon intercepted her at the junction of the main hall and the East Corridor at 9:40, and unlike his previous attempts at casual surveillance, this time he was waiting for her. Positioned with his back to the wall and his arms loose at his sides, the body language of a man who had decided to stop being subtle. "Where are you going?" he asked. "To bed," Elena said. "I came down for water." She was not carrying water. They both knew that. "The East Corridor doesn't go to the kitchen," Damon said. "I took a wrong turn. You've been in this house for 8 days. You don't take wrong turns." Elena stopped walking. She faced him fully, which was a choice. She could have kept moving, forced him to physically block her, which would have escalated things past where she wanted them tonight. Instead, she stopped, and she looked at him, and she waited. He didn't like the waiting. She'd already figured that out. Damon Ashbourne was a man accustomed to other people filling silence when he applied it. When it didn't work, it destabilized him in small ways. "What is it you think you're going to find in this house?" he asked. "I'm not looking for anything," she said. "I live here." "You've been going through the East Wing." The staff mentioned it. "The staff? Which staff?" "Probably. Or someone reporting to Marcus." I was exploring. "It's a large house. I was curious. About a storage corridor. About my new home." Damon pushed off the wall. He wasn't threatening. He was too careful for that, and she suspected he understood on some level that moving on her physically would be a mistake he couldn't walk back. But he crossed into the space between them until he was close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw. "Let me tell you something about this house," he said. "Every inch of it has a history that belongs to this family. Not to people who walked in the door last week with a suitcase and a marriage certificate. And yet here I am," Elena said, "for now." The flatness of it was meant to be a threat. She let it sit, Damon. She kept her voice even. "I understand that this situation is uncomfortable for you. I understand that you have opinions about my marriage and my intentions and my presence in this house. I'm not asking you to like it, but I am asking you to consider," she held his eyes, "whether this is really the hill you want to fight on tonight. Because I'm going to bed either way, and all you're accomplishing right now is making it clear that you're watching me. Which means I know to be more careful." She walked past him. He said nothing. She made it back to the bedroom wing, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed, with her hands pressed flat on her knees, and breathed through the adrenaline for 3 full minutes before she could trust herself to move normally. Too close, too early. She needed to be more careful. Gerald Ashbourne arrived at breakfast on a Tuesday morning 12 days into Elena's residency, and the particular way the temperature in the room changed when he walked in told Elena everything she needed to know about who actually held power in this family. He was 64, Gerald, 3 years older than Victor, and carrying those years differently, softer in the body, harder in the face, with the kind of eyes that never fully committed to whatever expression surrounded them. He had the Ashbourne jaw, and none of Victor's stillness. Where Victor was a man who'd learned to be quiet, Gerald was a man who used motion and noise to fill space, to claim it, to prevent anyone else from occupying it comfortably. He sat down at the head of the table. He looked at Elena as if she'd been left there by mistake. "So," he said, not to her, to Victor, who was sitting 2 seats down with coffee, and the financial section, and the very specific stillness he deployed when he was bracing for something. "This is the wife Elena," Victor said. "Yes." Gerald turned to her then. Full attention, the kind that felt less like interest and more like appraisal. "You're younger than I expected." "People often say that," Elena said pleasantly. "What do you do professionally, I mean?" "Architectural design. I run my own firm. Small currently, but he didn't need the qualifier." "Victor mentioned you're interested in community development work, among other things." Gerald picked up his coffee. The conversation's surface was perfectly civil. Underneath it, she could feel the structure of it. The questions designed to establish what she knew, what she wanted, how much of a problem she was going to be. She'd been in enough rooms with men like Gerald Ashbourne to understand how this type of intelligence gathering worked. They didn't ask what they wanted to know. They asked everything adjacent to it and watched where your eyes went. "The Calloway Street proposal," Gerald said. "You submitted that." "I did. It's a well-researched document." He said it the way men like him said things they didn't mean as compliments. "Thorough. Doesn't pencil out, but thorough." That's what Damon said. Something crossed Gerald's face, too fast to name, when she said Damon's name with that particular casualness. She filed it. Yes, well, Damon's assessment was correct. He set down his cup. "I hope you understand that your marriage to my brother doesn't change the family's position on existing projects." "Of course," Elena said. "I wouldn't expect it to." The ease of her response clearly unsettled him. He'd expected pushback, or at minimum some show of ambition, something he could point at and call manipulation. She gave him nothing to hold. "Good," he said. He picked up his paper. The conversation, as far as he was concerned, was over. Elena ate her breakfast and did not look at Victor and did not look at Gerald and kept her face in the calm, pleasant arrangement she'd been practicing for 12 days. Underneath it, her mind was running very fast. She found the first real thing 3 days later. Not the vault, not yet. What she found was in the study adjacent to the East Wing library, in a filing cabinet that was locked but not seriously locked, with a standard pin tumbler that took her father's key less than 10 seconds to rule out, and another 3 minutes with a small tool she'd learned to use when she was 22 and doing site surveys. In buildings with absent landlords and rusted locks. The files inside were unremarkable on the surface. Property records, transfer documents, the standard paper archaeology of a real estate operation running across multiple jurisdictions. Elena photographed everything with her phone, replaced the files exactly as she'd found them, and relocked the cabinet. Back in her room, she went through the photographs. The first 12 documents were exactly what they appeared to be. The 13th made her stop. It was a property transfer record. Calloway Street, but not the current development project. This was from 11 years ago. A purchase of 3 residential buildings at the north end of the Calloway corridor, well before the Ashbourne Group had any public-facing interest in the neighborhood. The purchase was made through a shell company called Meridian Property Associates. The listed contact for Meridian was a law firm in Delaware, whose name Elena recognized from her father's files. He'd mentioned it once, in the early days of her grief when she'd been going through his papers, looking for a reason, and she'd been too lost to understand what she was seeing. She cross-referenced it on her phone. Meridian Property Associates had 12 registered subsidiaries across 4 states. 3 of them appeared in the transfer documents she'd found in the study. 2 of those 3 appeared in the partial archive Victor had given her, the incomplete evidence her father had collected before he died. It wasn't the full picture, but it was the outline of the picture. And it was uglier than she had let herself fully imagine. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. Not panicking. Not even afraid yet, not exactly. Just holding the shape of what she was beginning to understand and letting it settle into something she could work with. Her father had found this. He'd found it and documented it and tried to build a case, and someone had made sure he never finished. She thought about that, really sat with it for about 4 minutes. Then she put it somewhere internal and locked it there, because she couldn't afford to feel it right now, and she got back to work. Claudia cornered her the following afternoon. Elena had been expecting it. Claudia had been orbiting her for 2 weeks, with the tension of a woman building towards something, and the pressure had been climbing visibly. The location was the solarium, which in the Ashbourne house layout meant a room of glass and carefully maintained plants and no easy exits. Claudia came in, closed the door behind her, and stood with her back to it. "I want to talk to you woman to woman," Claudia said. "All right," Elena said. She set down her sketchbook. "I'm not going to pretend that I understand this." Claudia's voice was controlled, but the control was costing. Her Elena could see it in the set of her shoulders, the way her hands stayed clasped in front of her. "Victor is a grown man, and I have no authority over his choices. But I have been in this family for 40 years, and I know every person who has tried to use our name for their own purposes, and I am telling you clearly that I see what this is." "What is it?" Elena asked. "You're angry," Claudia said, "about what happened at the gala. Damon's behavior was—" She paused, recalibrating mid-sentence blunt. "I'll grant you that. He can be blunt, but that doesn't justify. I didn't marry Victor because of what Damon said at the gala," Elena said. "Then why?" Elena looked at this woman, 67 years old, 40 years in a family that had built something enormous and rotten, and probably asked her to look away from most of it along the way. Wondered how much Claudia knew, and how much she'd chosen not to know, and whether there was a real difference. "Because Victor asked me to," Elena said, "and because the reasons he gave me made sense." "What reasons? You'd have to ask him." Claudia's jaw tightened. "I'm asking you, I know." Elena held her gaze steadily. "And I'm telling you that this is between Victor and me. I'm not your enemy, Claudia. I have no interest in your family's money, or your standing, or your history. What I am interested in is finishing some work that was started a long time ago." She picked her sketchbook back up. "So I'd appreciate it if we could figure out how to be in the same house without this kind of conversation." Claudia stared at her. Something moved behind the older woman's eyes. Something that might have been calculation, or might have been the early shape of fear. She left without another word. Elena stared at the sketchbook page she wasn't seeing, and breathed through her nose and reminded herself, not yet. Not yet, not yet. Victor found her in the East Wing Library that night at 11. She'd been going through periodical archives-back issues of financial publications that no one had touched in years, which made them safe cross-referencing dates against the property transfer records she'd photographed. Victor came in, closed the door quietly, and sat across the reading table from her without being asked. "Gerald called me into his study this afternoon," Victor said. Elena looked up. "And he wants me to file a post-nuptial agreement. His attorneys drafted something. He presented it as standard family estate protection." "Is it?" "The clause on intellectual property and proprietary business information is not standard." Victor's voice was flat. "It would legally obligate you to disclose and surrender any business intelligence gathered during the course of the marriage, specifically as it relates to Ashbourne Group Holdings." The room went quiet. Elena set down her penny nose, she said. "He suspects," Victor corrected. "If he knew, we wouldn't be having a post-nuptial conversation. He'd be doing something else." He looked at her. "But he suspects enough to try this. Which means the window is closing. How long do we have?" "Days, not weeks," he said it simply. "He will use every legal tool available to him once he moves." Gerald is not, Victor exhaled. He is not someone who responds well to being outmaneuvered. When he decides you're a threat, his first instinct is to eliminate the threat, and he has the resources and the contacts to make that complicated for you. Elena thought about the shell companies, about Meridian Property Associates, about 11 years of carefully constructed false walls and a law firm in Delaware, about her father. The East Wing basement, she said. We need to get there tonight. Gerald has Marcus on double rotation this week. I know. She'd clocked the change in Marcus's patterns 2 days ago. More overlap between shift changes, fewer windows. There's a maintenance access point through the boiler room that Marcus doesn't cover during the 11 to midnight window. I found it Thursday. It adds 8 minutes to the route, but it works. Victor looked at her with that expression again, the one she'd started thinking of as his version of something like awe, filtered through 61 years of being a man who didn't show awe easily. When did you... I've been mapping the house since day 2, Elena said. I didn't know when we'd need it. I just knew we would. She stood up and began collecting the documents she'd spread across the table. Go back to your study. Act normal for an hour. I'll come to you. Elena, Victor, she looked at him. This is what I'm built for. Let me do it. He nodded. He left. Elena put the documents in the false bottom of the sketchbook bag she carried everywhere and stood in the library for a moment, alone with the smell of old paper and the distant sound of the house settling in the cold. She was not afraid. That was either the bravest thing about her or the most dangerous. She honestly wasn't sure which. The boiler room access point was exactly where she'd calculated it would be. She and Victor moved through the maintenance corridor at 11:40, using the low-power flashlight on Victor's phone rather than the overhead lighting, which was on a manual switch panel that also controlled the monitoring board in Marcus's security station. 11 minutes through tight, dusty space, and then a steel door with an old model padlock that predated the house's modernized security system by at least 15 years. She held up the key. The keyhole was the right size. She put the key in the lock. It didn't turn. She pulled it out, checked the orientation, put it back in. Still nothing. The cold in the corridor was sharp and real, and Victor was standing 2 feet behind her and not saying anything, which she was grateful for, because her hands had gone tight and her mind was doing that thing it did, under pressure, where it ran through every possibility simultaneously, and none of them felt good. This isn't the right lock, she said, kept her voice level. No. Victor's voice was odd. I didn't think it would be. She turned. In the thin light from his phone, his face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. You knew? I suspected, he said. Your father said the lock was inside the house. I've always understood that to mean inside the main residential structure. This is the service wing, technically the same property, but your father was a precise man. He meant the house itself. The realization moved through her like cold water. The main residential structure, she said. You've never been able to search it properly because the residential wing is where the family lives, Victor said. Where Gerald lives. And searching it without a reason to be there, was he paused. Something I couldn't do, without drawing exactly the kind of attention we couldn't afford. But I can. Elena felt it settle into place, the geometry of it, the terrible elegance. I live there. I belong in those rooms. A wife walking through her own house isn't suspicious. No, Victor said. She isn't. They looked at each other in the dark. He planned this, Elena said. Not angry, just landing on it, turning it over. My father. He left the key with me instead of with you, because he knew I would need a reason to be inside that house. He knew that Victor, she caught herself, that this arrangement would be the way in. I think so, Victor said quietly. Yes. He planned for the possibility that he wouldn't survive long enough to finish this himself, Elena said. And he set up the pieces so that someone else could. She said it out loud, and it cost her something to say it. Not tears, she didn't have access to those right now, but something in her chest that compressed and held and stayed held. Her father had been that afraid, and that smart, and he had been right on both counts. We need to go back, Victor said. It's late, Marcus. I know. She put the key back in her pocket. Tomorrow. I start searching the residential wing tomorrow. They retraced the route through the maintenance corridor, quiet and careful, and came out through the boiler room and separated into the parts of the house where they were supposed to be And Elena lay in the dark of her room and did not sleep and stared at the ceiling and thought about a man who had built an exit plan for his own death and left the pieces to the daughter he'd raised to finish what he'd started. She thought about the post-nuptial document, sitting in Gerald's attorney's hands. Days, not weeks. She turned onto her side. She closed her eyes. She was still awake at 3 in the morning when she heard the footsteps in the corridor outside her door. Too deliberate to be accidental, too quiet to be housekeeping. And she lay absolutely still and listened to them slow and stop just outside her room. And then continue. And then stop again. And then, after a silence of perhaps 40 seconds, retreat. She got up, checked the hallway. Empty. At the junction of the hall and the main staircase, a single light was on, the small lamp that normally stayed off at night. Someone had been out there. Someone knew she'd been up. She went back to her room, locked the door, sat on the floor with her back against the bed, and the key in her hand and the full weight of what she was inside pressing down on her. Not fear, not exactly, but something older and heavier. The thing that lives in the body when a person finally understands that there is no safe version of the road they're on. She'd crossed into territory she couldn't walk back from. Whatever happened next, Elena Vale was in it to the end. Because the moment Gerald Ashbourne decided she was a problem, there was no neutral ground left. The point of no return wasn't ahead of her. She was already standing in the middle of it. She found it on the 4th day of searching the residential wing. Not the vault, not yet. What she found first was smaller than that and worse. She had been working through the house systematically, the way her father had taught her to approach any search. Start with the places that felt too obvious to check, because people hid things in plain sight more often than they hid them in clever places. She'd gone through the main library first, running her fingers along the backs of shelves, checking whether any of the wall panels had the slightly different resonance of hollow space behind them. Nothing. The formal dining room, the morning room, the study off the main entrance that Gerald used for family meetings, but not for actual work. Nothing and nothing. On the 4th day, she went into the portrait gallery. It was a long room on the 2nd floor of the residential wing, running the full length of the east-facing wall, lined with Ashbourne family portraits going back 4 generations. Elena had walked through it twice before without stopping. It was the kind of room that announced its own importance so loudly that it rarely occurred to anyone to look at it carefully. The portraits stared down with the permanent authority of people who had always assumed they deserved to be remembered. She walked slowly this time, not looking at the portraits, looking at the wall between them. The anomaly was behind the 4th portrait from the north end, a painting of a man she'd tentatively identified as Gerald's grandfather based on the date plate at the bottom. The frame was slightly thicker than the others. Barely. Maybe half an inch. She wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't been running her hand along the wall at frame height, feeling for any variation in depth. She pressed the frame at the lower right corner. Nothing happened. She tried the upper left. A soft click. Just one, and then the painting swung forward, on a concealed hinge, slow and smooth, the way things move when they've been built to last. Behind it was a wall panel, and set into the panel, a lock. Small brass old. She held up the key, her hand was not shaking. She noticed that and was mildly surprised by it. Her body apparently hadn't caught up yet to the magnitude of what was happening. The key went in, the key turned, the panel opened. The archive was not what she'd imagined. She had pictured files, folders, the neat documentary evidence of a careful man, organized and indexed the way her father organized everything. What she found instead was a metal box, roughly the size of a hardcover book, locked with a second mechanism, a combination dial, and beside it, taped to the inside of the panel wall, a single folded piece of paper. She took the paper first. It was her father's handwriting. She'd know it anywhere, the particular forward lean of it, the way he pressed harder on certain letters than others. A habit she'd noticed as a child and never forgotten. Elena, if you found this, then Victor kept his word and you found a reason to be inside the house. I'm sorry I couldn't give you a better reason. I'm sorry for all of it. The combination is the date your mother, and I brought you home from the hospital. You know the one. You've heard the story enough times. What's in this box will frighten you. Some of it will make you angry in ways that don't have easy edges. Before you open it, understand. I documented everything I could verify. Nothing in there is speculation. Everything in there is real. Finish what I started. Not for me, for the people it hurt. Your father. Elena stood in the portrait gallery, with the note in her hand, and her father's voice in her head, and the particular specific grief of a person who has just received a message from someone who knew, when they wrote it, that they were writing to a future in which they no longer existed. She gave herself 90 seconds. She counted them in her head. Then she put the note in her pocket, took the metal box off its shelf, tucked it under her arm, replaced the panel, pressed the frame back into position, and walked out of the portrait gallery with a measured stride and a face that showed nothing. She opened the box in Victor's study with the door locked and the curtains drawn. The combination was April 14th, the day her parents brought her home 2 days late because there had been a snowstorm and her mother had refused to let her father drive in the snow, so they'd stayed an extra night in the hospital, and her father had eaten vending machine sandwiches for 48 hours and complained about it for the rest of his life. April 14. The lock opened. Inside the box were two things, a USB drive and a handwritten ledger 40 pages, dense in the same forward-leaning script as the note. Dates going back 18 years. Names, account numbers, transfer amounts, notations in a shorthand that Elena recognized immediately because her father had used the same shorthand system in his personal notebooks. She plugged the USB drive into Victor's laptop. It opened to a folder containing 63 files. The first file was labeled simply Meridian. She opened it. It took her 11 minutes to read through it. When she finished, she sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling and let the silence of the room hold her while her mind worked through what she'd just understood. Meridian Property Associates was not a standard shell company. She'd already known it was connected to the Ashbourne group. What she hadn't known, what the file made devastatingly clear, was the full scope of what it had been used for. Over a period of 14 years, Meridian had been used to purchase properties across 6 cities under market value, using funds that had been siphoned from the Ashbourne Group's legitimate investment portfolio through a series of falsified vendor contracts. The properties were then resold at artificially inflated prices to a second shell company, generating paper profits that were cycled back into the group as legitimate investment returns. The entire structure was a financial laundering operation of significant scale, not the largest she'd ever read about, but sophisticated enough to have survived 14 years without triggering a serious audit. And the properties weren't random. Several of them were in neighborhoods where genuine community displacement had occurred, where longtime residents had been forced out as property values spiked, where small businesses had closed, where the texture of working-class life had been methodically erased, not as a byproduct of development, but as a mechanism of it. The displacement was engineered. It was the point. The Callaway Street neighborhood. 3 other neighborhoods across the city. Her father had documented all of it. But that wasn't what made Elena sit very still, with her hands flat on her knees for 4 full minutes after she finished the first file. What stopped her was the name at the top of the authorization chain. Not Gerald Ashbourne. Not anyone she'd expected. The name on the authorization documents, the signature on every major Meridian transaction across 14 years, the name that appeared in the incorporation documents, and the board resolutions, and the fund transfer approvals, was Victor's. She heard Victor's key in the study door at 6:15. She had not moved from the chair. The laptop was open in front of her. The Meridian file was on the screen. Victor came in, closed the door, turned, and stopped. He read her face. Whatever he saw there made him set down the book. He was carrying very carefully the way a person sets something down when they want their hands free. "Elena, sit down," she said. Her voice was even. She was almost proud of how even it was, considering. Victor sat in the chair across the desk. He looked at the laptop screen. His face did not change in any dramatic way, no flinch, no sudden pallor. Just a settling, a kind of resignation that told her he'd known this moment was coming and had been deciding what to do with it for a long time. "How long have you known that your name was on the Meridian documents?" she asked. The silence lasted 4 seconds. "From the beginning," Victor said. The words landed in the room and stayed there. "From the beginning," Elena repeated. "Yes." She looked at him, tried to find something in his face that she'd missed some layer of performance she could point to and call the lie. She didn't find it. Whatever Victor was right now, he wasn't lying, which was its own kind of problem. "Explain it to me," she said. "Explain it clearly, and don't waste my time." Victor leaned forward, elbows on his knees, And for the first time since she'd known him, he looked his age, all 61 years of it, pressed into the lines of his face at once. Meridian was Gerald's operation. The structure, the strategy, the execution, all Gerald. But 12 years ago, Gerald came to me with a financing problem. A gap in one of the early Meridian transactions that he needed covered on paper. He said it was temporary. He said it was a bridge. He needed my name on the authorization because he needed someone with a clean financial record to sign off. Victor stopped. Breathed. I said no the first time. He asked again. And the third time he came to me, he made it clear that saying no had consequences I wasn't prepared for. What consequences? There were things Gerald had documentation on, Victor said quietly, from years earlier. Financial decisions I made in my 30s that weren't clean. Nothing on the scale of Meridian, but enough. Enough that if he wanted to use it, it would have ended my ability to operate independently. Ended everything I'd spent 20 years building. He held her gaze. I made a choice I shouldn't have made. I signed the documents. And once I had ONSI, my name was on the first authorization. Gerald had exactly what he needed to keep it on the rest of them. The shape of it was almost elegant in how airtight it was. A classic trap. One signature and the trap closed around you. My father found out, Elena said, yes, about 8 months before he died. Victor didn't look away. He came to me. Not angry, your father wasn't an angry man by instinct. He was precise. He told me what he'd found, and he told me he was building a case, and he told me that he understood I hadn't had a real choice the first time, but that I had a choice now. He gave me the chance to cooperate, and I told him I needed time. I was afraid. I'm not going to pretend I was anything other than afraid. Afraid of Gerald, afraid of what cooperation meant legally, afraid of what I'd lose. Victor's jaw tightened. Your father gave me 2 weeks. At the end of those 2 weeks, he died. The silence in the room was absolute. Elena didn't move. She was aware of her own breathing steady, controlled, the breath of a person who is keeping themselves together through the sheer application of will, and of the cold in the room that didn't come from the temperature. You think Gerald killed him, she said. I think Gerald became aware that your father was building a case, and I think Gerald made a decision, Victor said. I can't prove it. I've never been able to prove it. Everything I have is circumstantial. But yes, that's what I believe. And you've been carrying that for 4 years. Yes. While I've been trying to make sense of his death with no information and no help, and nothing but a key I didn't understand. Her voice cracked on the last word. Just slightly. She pressed it back down. You knew. You knew what the key was for. You knew what happened to him. And you waited 4 years. I was afraid, Victor said again. And the repetition of it, the plainness, the refusal to dress it up in anything more dignified, was the only thing that kept her from standing up and leaving the room. Were you afraid when you married me? She asked. Was that part of the fear? Using me to do what you couldn't? No, his voice was firm on that, firmer than anything else he'd said. I married you because you were the only person left who had both the reason and the capability to finish this. I married you because your father trusted me, and I failed him, and this was the only way I could think of to make it right. He stopped himself. It doesn't make any of this clean. I know that. Elena stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him, looking out at the grounds, at the last pale light of the day sitting on the tree line. She was working something through. She could feel the machinery of it, her mind running every scenario, every implication, every changed coordinate of the situation she was now actually in. Victor's name on those documents changed everything. She brought what she'd found to federal investigators, and she was going to. That part hadn't changed Victor's authorization signatures, put him inside the conspiracy. Maybe not as an architect, maybe with mitigating circumstances that a good attorney could work with, but inside it. Legally implicated, potentially prosecuted. He knew that. He'd known it when he proposed this arrangement. He'd walked into this situation, knowing that the evidence that would expose Gerald would also implicate himself. She turned around. You understand that your name on those documents doesn't disappear because of your cooperation, she said. I know, you could go to prison. I know that too. She studied him. Is that why you've been building the legitimate foundation assets? Setting up the trust? You've been preparing to lose everything. I've been preparing to do what I should have done 4 years ago, Victor said. Whatever the cost. Elena stood there in the failing light of the study and tried to locate something solid in the situation. some fixed point she could use to orient everything else. The ground had shifted so many times in the last 18 days that she'd lost count. She'd come into this house with a key and a plan, and the plan was still intact in its broad strokes, but the shape of it had changed entirely. She had the evidence. She had the authorization trail. She had Victor compromised, legally exposed, but cooperating. What she didn't have was time, because Gerald was already moving. She found out exactly how fast Gerald was moving the next morning. She came down to breakfast, and the family attorney was already there, a man named Halverson, who'd been handling Ashbourne Group legal affairs for 20 years, who wore the same expression at every interaction Elena had witnessed, which was the expression of a man whose entire professional life was built on knowing things and never saying them. Gerald was at the table. Claudia was not. Damon was, positioned with the particular careful casualness of someone who had been told to be present. Halverson set a document in front of Elena before she'd even sat down. "What's this?" she asked. "The post-nuptial agreement," Halverson said. "Mr. Ashbourne would like it executed this morning." Elena looked at Gerald. "Good morning to you, too." Gerald's face was pleasant, in the specific way of a man who has already won and is simply waiting for the other party to understand it. "We'd like to resolve this quickly. The terms are straightforward." Elena sat down. She picked up the document. Read through it at the measured pace of someone who wasn't panicking, which she was not quite, though the space between not panicking and panicking had compressed considerably since yesterday evening. The intellectual property clause Victor had warned her about was there, expanded now broader in scope, covering any information gathered or discovered during the marriage that related to Ashbourne Group business, holdings, or personnel. Signing it would effectively make everything she'd found in the past 4 days legally surrendered, the moment Gerald's lawyers became aware she had it. She set the document down. "I'll need to have my own attorney review this," she said. "Of course," Halverson said smoothly. "We'd simply ask that you not take longer than 48 hours. Mr. Ashbourne has some time-sensitive restructuring underway." "Restructuring," Elena said. "Standard portfolio management." Gerald picked up his coffee. "Nothing that affects you." It was not nothing. She knew from the Meridian files that any significant restructuring of the Ashbourne portfolio right now would involve moving assets through exactly the shell company structure her father had documented, and that if Gerald was accelerating that process, it was because he knew or suspected that the evidence existed somewhere, and he was trying to move the money before it could be frozen. She had 48 hours. Less, probably. Because Halverson would tell Gerald the moment Elena contacted an outside attorney, and that contact alone would confirm his suspicion that she had something worth protecting. She needed to move that night. She told Victor at noon in the gardens, walking at a pace that looked like exercise and was actually the minimum distance from the house at which she felt comfortable talking. She laid it out quickly, the 48 hours, the restructuring, the implication of what Gerald was doing with the portfolio. Victor listened. His face stayed level, but she'd gotten good enough at reading him to see the shift beneath it, the tightening around his eyes, the slight change in how he held his shoulders. "He's accelerating the Meridian transfers," Victor said. "That's what it looks like. If he completes the restructuring before the evidence reaches investigators, the money trail gets cold. The transfers become legitimate transactions within a restructured portfolio. Much harder to reverse, much harder to prosecute." "I know." Elena kept walking. "We go tonight, we don't wait." "The evidence on the USB drive. It's enough," she said. "It's not everything we'd want, but it's enough to open a federal investigation. And once that investigation opens, Gerald's ability to restructure is frozen." She paused at the garden's edge, looked out at nothing in particular. "I've already made contact." Victor stopped walking. She turned to look at him. "Yesterday afternoon, while you were with Halverson, I reached out through a contact I've had for 2 years, a former colleague whose husband works in the financial crimes division. I didn't send anything yet. I told him I had material of significant interest and I needed a secure channel and a timeline. He responded at 9 this morning. The channel is open. I can transmit tonight." Victor stared at her. "If Gerald's people are monitoring the house network." "I'm not using the house network," Elena said. "I bought a prepaid device 6 days ago. I've been keeping it in the garden shed." She watched his face move through surprise and land somewhere that looked almost like relief. I've been preparing for this since the morning after I found the footsteps outside my door. I just needed the evidence to transmit. He exhaled, long and slow. What do you need from me tonight? He asked. Access to your study's external hard line. Not the wireless, the physical line, the one that bypasses the house network and runs directly to the external router. I need it for the file size. I can have it available by 10. Good. She turned back toward the house. Tell no one. Not the staff, not she paused, not anyone. She'd been about to say not Damon. She wasn't sure why she'd stopped herself on that one. She filed it somewhere to examine later. At 8:40 that evening, Damon came to her door. She heard the knock 3, measured not the aggressive pattern she'd come to associate with his bad moods, and she set down the USB drive she'd been holding and crossed the room and opened the door 3 inches. Damon looked worse than she'd seen him since she'd arrived. Something in his face was off. The careful assembly of it was slipping, the managed composure showing stress fractures. His eyes were moving the way. Eyes move when a person is trying to figure out how to say something they've been circling for a long time. I need to talk to you, he said. It's late, I know. 5 minutes. He looked down the corridor both ways, a quick instinctive check that she recognized as the behavior of a man who just understood that his own house might not be safe to talk in. Please. Something in the please moved her, not because she trusted it. She wasn't in a position to trust anyone in this family, but because the word was so uncharacteristic that its presence meant something she needed to know. She opened the door wider. He came in. She closed the door. She didn't offer him a seat, and he didn't take one, just stood in the middle of the room, with his hands loose at his sides and his jaw working through something internal. My father showed me something tonight, Damon said. A report. A financial analysis his attorneys put together. He stopped. And there's a section on Victor. He looked at her directly. On money that moved through accounts connected to Victor and then to another stop, longer this time. To a series of property transactions. He exhaled hard through his nose. I need to know if you know about this. Elena looked at him. Measured the situation. In this moment, on this night, with 6 hours, until she needed to transmit everything she had, the decision she made in the next 30 seconds mattered more than almost any other she'd make. Why? She asked. Because if you know about it, then you came into this house knowing, Damon said. And if you came in knowing, then everything He stopped himself short of finishing that sentence, but the shape of it was there in the air. Then this is more serious than my father is telling me it is. What is your father telling you it is? That Victor's financial irregularities are a family problem to be managed internally. Damon's voice had gone flat. That Victor made some poor decisions, and that the family will address them appropriately, and that the postnuptial agreement with you is about protecting the estate from liability connected to Victor's issues. And you believe that? Damon looked at her. No, he said. I don't. The honesty of it landed with a force she hadn't expected. Sit down, she said. He sat, she stayed standing. She was thinking at speed, running the variables, calculating what telling him cost and what it gained, what the risk was, whether the risk was acceptable given where they were now. Every instinct she had said, don't trust him. He was Gerald's son. He had every reason to take whatever she told him directly back to his father. But there was something in his face that she recognized. Because she'd seen it in the mirror during the years, she'd been trying to make sense of her father's death. The specific expression of a person who has just realized that the foundation of everything they thought they understood is not what they were told it was. Damon was starting to understand something about his father. And that understanding was clearly costing him something real. The postnuptial agreement isn't about Victor, she said carefully. Not primarily. Your father wants it executed because he thinks I've found something. He's right. She watched Damon's face. Victor's name is connected to your father's financial operation, but not the way your father's attorneys are presenting it. Victor was coerced. Your father used existing leverage to get Victor's signature on documents that made Victor look like a willing participant. She stopped. The actual architect of what's in those documents is your father, and it goes back 18 years. The silence in the room had a quality she hadn't heard before. Damon sat very still. He was doing the thing she'd only seen him do once, at the gala in the moment before he'd chosen cruelty over decency, where the internal machinery was running visibly, working through something his face couldn't quite contain. What did he do? Damon asked, quietly. completely unlike himself. Elena looked at the man who had once called her nobody in front of a room full of witnesses. She took a breath and she began to tell him. She didn't tell him everything. She told him the shape of it, the shell companies, the property displacement, the laundering operation, the scale. She watched his face as each piece landed. She watched the color shift in it, the way his jaw set and then released and then set again. When she stopped talking, he was looking at the floor. The Callaway Street neighborhood, he said. Yes. That was part of it, the most recent iteration of it. Yes. Damon looked up when I told you that project didn't pencil out. You probably genuinely believed that, Elena said. Because the numbers you were given to work from weren't real. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it, watched the meaning of it move through him. That the confidence with which he'd dismissed her work and dismissed the neighborhood's residents and dismissed the 311 signatures had been built on fabricated mathematics provided by his own father. How long have you known? He asked. Long enough. Does Victor knows everything I know. She held his gaze. Tonight, I'm going to send everything I have to federal investigators. Your father's restructuring of the portfolio, which I assume he explained to you as something routine, is an attempt to move the money before a case can be built. I have a window of hours, not days. Damon stood up. She tensed, couldn't help it, the body doing its own calculations independent of the mind. But he wasn't moving toward her. He was just standing. Processing. Breathing through something that was too big for the room. If you send that tonight, he said slowly, my father. Yes. The family, yes. He looked at her. The entitlement and the hostility and the careful armor of a man raised to believe he was important. She could see it cracking in real time, and underneath it something younger and rawer, and she thought, more honest than anything she'd seen from him since she arrived. What do you need from me? He asked. She had not expected that question. She had prepared for a dozen different versions of this conversation. She had not prepared for this one right now, she said. I need you to go back to your room and act like nothing has happened and not talk to anyone until tomorrow morning. And after tomorrow morning? After tomorrow morning, Elena said everything changes. And you're going to have to decide who you are when it does. Damon nodded once. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the knob and didn't turn around. At the gala, he said, What I said to you, don't, Elena said. Not meanly, just firmly. Not tonight, he left. Elena stood in the middle of her room with the USB drive in her hand and the full weight of the night had sitting on her shoulders, and understood with absolute clarity that she had just made a decision she couldn't unmake. She had told Damon Ashbourne enough to bring this entire operation down if he chose to walk it directly to his father. She had done it anyway. Because underneath all of it, underneath the strategy and the evidence, and the 4 years of grief, and the key and the vault, and the 48-hour window, she had looked at his face and seen the thing that mattered more than any of it. He hadn't known. He had been cruel, and he had been arrogant, and he had said things to her that still lived in her chest like splinters. But he had not known what his father had built, and now he did. She put the USB drive in her pocket. She checked the time. She had 6 hours, one hard line, and everything her father had died to preserve. She gave herself 3 minutes after Damon left. 3 minutes to stand in the center of her room and breathe and let her body understand what her mind had already decided. The adrenaline was there. She could feel it in her hands, in the shallow pull of her breath, in the way sound seemed sharper than it should have been. The old house creaking and settling around her like it was listening. Then she put the USB drive in the interior pocket of her jacket, zipped it closed, and moved. The corridor outside her room was empty, 10:47 on her watch. Victor had said the hard line would be available by 10, which meant he was already waiting. She took the back route she'd memorized down the servant's stair, through the kitchen passage, along the utility corridor that ran parallel to the main hall, and counted her steps the way her father had taught her to count steps in unfamiliar buildings. You always knew your way out if you counted your steps going in. Victor's study was dark from the outside. She knocked twice, the pattern they'd agreed on. The door opened immediately. Victor's face in the thin light from his desk lamp was the face of a man who had not slept and did not intend to. He stepped back. She came in. He closed and locked the door behind her. The external hardline terminal was already set up on the corner of his desk, a physical port connected to a cable that ran through the wall to an external router that bypassed the house's internal network entirely. Victor had explained its existence when she first asked. It was a legacy system from the early days of the house's renovation, installed for a purpose that had long been forgotten, and because it predated the modern security infrastructure, it existed outside of Marcus's monitoring grid. Elena pulled out the prepaid device, connected it to the terminal with the adapter she'd bought alongside it, and opened the secure upload channel her contact had provided. The connection took 40 seconds to establish. She started the file transfer. The folder containing the 63 files from the USB drive, the Meridian documentation, the transaction records, the authorization chain with Victor's name, and the full 14-year history of the operation, began moving across the channel at a rate that her contact system would capture on the other end and route immediately to the Financial Crimes Division. Estimated transfer time, 19 minutes. She and Victor did not speak. There was nothing to say that needed saying right now. She stood over the terminal and watched the progress bar and breathed evenly, and Victor stood the window and watched the grounds, and they both waited. 4 minutes in, every light in the house went out. Not a gradual dimming, not a flicker. All of it, every lamp, every indicator light on every piece of equipment in the study, the small LD on the external, route all of it gone simultaneously, in the same instant, the way power goes when someone cuts it at the source. The transfer died. Elena looked at the dead terminal. In the sudden dark, she heard Victor move 2 steps, the sound of him catching himself against the edge of the desk. "That's not a power outage," Victor said. "No," Elena said. "It's not." Her eyes were adjusting. Enough ambient light came from the grounds outside security license a separate generator. She noted to make out the shapes of things. She grabbed the prepaid device, disconnected it from the dead terminal, checked its screen. 41% of the files had transferred. Not everything. Enough? Maybe, possibly. The Meridian structure was in the first batch of files. The authorization chain was in the first batch. Whether 41% was enough to open an investigation she couldn't know right now, and right now didn't matter. What mattered was that someone in this house had just cut the power to stop her, which meant someone knew what she was doing, which meant the window had just collapsed from hours to minutes. "We need to get to the vault," she said. "The power. The vault opens mechanically. The key and the combination. It doesn't need power." She was already moving toward the door. "The ledger is still in there. The handwritten records. That's original documentation. Physical evidence that doesn't need to be transmitted. It needs to be gotten out of this house tonight." Victor was moving with her. She heard him behind her, his breathing controlled but accelerated, the sound of a 61-year-old man who understood the situation completely and was keeping up anyway. She unlocked the study door and opened it. The corridor was not empty. Marcus was standing 12 feet away, and he was not alone. 2 other men flanked him house security, faces Elena had cataloged in her first week, positions and patrol patterns mapped and filed. All 3 of them were in the corridor, with the particular stillness of people who had been positioned there, not arrived there. They'd been waiting. Marcus looked at Elena, then at Victor, then back at Elena. His expression was not hostile. It was worse than hostile. It was the expression of a man executing a task he'd been given with the professional detachment of someone who does not consider the human cost of tasks. "Mr. Ashbourne would like to speak with you both," Marcus said. In the main study. Elena did not move. Her mind was running the device in her pocket, 41% transferred, the ledger in the vault behind the portrait, the physical key still on her person. Damon somewhere in this house, who may or may not have walked everything she'd told him directly to his father in the 4 hours since she'd sent him out of her room. She made herself breathe. "Of course," she said pleasantly. "Give us a moment." "He'd prefer now," Marcus said. Victor stepped forward, putting himself slightly in front of Elena, the protective instinct of it so reflexive, she doubted he'd done it consciously. "We'll be there in 5 minutes, Marcus." The pause lasted 3 seconds. 5 minutes, Marcus said. He didn't move from the corridor. He was not going to move from the corridor. Elena understood that the 5 minutes was accommodation, not permission, and that Marcus and his 2 colleagues would be standing exactly where they were standing until she and Victor walked past them toward the main study. She turned back into the room. Victor followed, pulled the door to, not closed, Marcus would notice a closed door and looked at her in the dark. The ledger, she said, barely above a whisper. I can't get to the portrait gallery without going past them. I know. She was thinking at speed, hands moving without instruction, checking her pocket. The device. The key. The key. Does the gallery have a secondary access? Service access? Maintenance? Anything? Victor was quiet for 2 seconds. The linen storage room on the south end of the residential wing shares a wall with the portrait gallery's north end. There's a utility pass-through. I'm not sure it's been used in 20 years. Wide enough to move through? I don't think so. Possibly. Is there any access to the linen storage room that doesn't go through the main corridor? The back stair from the laundry room. Elena looked at the door they'd left ajar. Past it, the shape of Marcus, waiting. I'm going to walk out of here and go to the main study, she said. You take the back stair. Get to the linen storage. Get through the pass-through if it exists. Get the ledger out of the vault, and get it out of the house. Your car is in the east garage? Yes. Keys? He reached into his jacket pocket, produced them, set them in her hand. She gave them back. You'll need them. Go out the east garden door. The one Marcus doesn't cover on night rotation, because the camera there has been on the maintenance list for 6 weeks and hasn't been fixed. I need you out of the building with the ledger before I finish with Gerald. She met his eyes. Can you do that? What are you going to do in that meeting? Buy you time. She straightened her jacket, felt the outline of the device in her pocket. 41%. Go. Victor put his hand briefly on her arm. Not a grip, just a touch. The kind that means something that words don't have the right shape for. And then he went to the back of the study and opened the secondary door that connected to the adjacent anteroom, and he was gone. Elena counted to 10. Then she walked out into the corridor. Ready, she said to Marcus. Gerald's main study was the room that told the truth about him. Not the polished, carefully presented truth of the foundation gala, or the family breakfast table, or the board meetings. The real truth. The room of a man who had never once doubted his right to take what he wanted and arrange it to his satisfaction. Dark wood, heavy furniture, the kind of deliberate masculine gravitas that communicated power without having to argue for it. The bookshelves held books that had clearly been purchased by category rather than read. The desk was enormous and almost entirely clear. The desk of a man who made other people handle the details and reserved the surface for the moments that mattered. Gerald was behind the desk. Claudia was not there. Halverson was standing to one side of the room with a leather folder and the expression of a man who had been paid to be present and intended to do exactly that and nothing more. And Damon was there, standing near the far window, arms crossed, not looking at her when she came in. Elena clocked all of it in the 2 seconds between the door opening and her crossing to the chair in front of Gerald's desk and sitting down without being invited to. She sat the way she'd sat at every meeting in her professional life, where she'd been the person with less power, spines straight, hands visible, face arranged in the particular kind of neutral that communicated neither submission nor aggression. Gerald looked at her. You've been busy, he said. I live here, Elena said. I move around. You've been transmitting data from this house through an unauthorized channel. She let a beat of silence sit. I'm not sure what you mean. The external router in Victor's study was connected to an outbound channel at approximately 10:50 this evening. The transmission was interrupted when the power was cut. Gerald's voice was perfectly even. The voice of a man who believed he'd won, whatever you sent, or attempted to send. I want to know what it was, where it went, and how much of it transferred. You cut the power to the house to stop a file transfer, Elena said. That's a significant response to a moving around problem. Elena. Gerald leaned forward, not threatening, something worse, something that was almost paternal. Explaining things to someone who hadn't understood them yet. I know why you're here. I've known for some time. Your father was a talented man, meticulous, and I respect that, I genuinely do. But he was working with incomplete information and making assumptions that the full picture doesn't support. Whatever he collected, whatever he believed he'd found, it tells one version of a more complicated story. He held her gaze. I'd like the chance to show you the rest of it. She looked at him. She thought about her father's note. Nothing in there is speculation. Everything in there is real. All right, she said. Show me. Gerald nodded at Halverson, who opened his folder and produced a document and slid it across the desk to her. Elena looked at it. It was a cooperation agreement. Dated 2 years ago. between the Ashbourne Group and a federal oversight body she recognized by its acronym. The kind of agreement that got constructed when a company self-reported compliance irregularities and entered into a monitored remediation process in exchange for reduced liability exposure. She read it carefully. It was real. The signatures were real. The federal seal was real. The case reference number was real. And if it was what it appeared to be, Gerald Ashbourne had voluntarily disclosed the Meridian structure 2 years ago to federal regulators and entered into a remediation process that was according to the document still ongoing. The world did a slow tilt. We self-reported, Gerald said. 2 years ago. Before your father's documentation could have reached anyone. Before anything you've been building in the last 3 weeks. He kept his voice level. The process is confidential, legally required to be during the remediation period, which is why it doesn't appear in any public record, which is why he paused. Your father never knew about it. He died before we disclosed. Elena set the document down. She was running at every angle, every implication at speed. If this was real, then the evidence she'd transmitted, however much of it had gone through before the power cut, would land in the hands of investigators who already had the case. The new material might strengthen the existing record or complicate the remediation. She couldn't predict, but Gerald's cooperation status meant his exposure was already managed, already negotiated, already contained, if this was real. She looked at the document again. I want to have my attorney verify this, she said. Of course. Gerald leaned back, the posture of a man who had just played his hand and was waiting for the other party to fold. In the meantime, I'd ask you to refrain from further transmissions. If the material you sent tonight reaches investigators who aren't managing the existing case, it creates a conflict that slows the entire remediation process, which doesn't serve anyone. Including you, Elena said. Including me. Yes, she sat with it. Her mind was not folding. Her mind was doing the thing it had been built to do, running the structure of what she was being told against the structure of what she actually knew, looking for the place where the two didn't line up. The cooperation agreement was dated 2 years ago. Her father died 4 years ago. Gerald was saying her father died before the disclosure. Gerald was saying the disclosure came after, as if Gerald had chosen to come forward belatedly, after the threat your father represented had been removed. She kept her face very still, because the cooperation agreement didn't explain why her father died. It didn't explain the footsteps outside her room. It didn't explain the postnuptial clause about proprietary information, which would have been unnecessary if everything was already disclosed to regulators. It didn't explain why Gerald had moved to accelerate the portfolio restructuring in the last 48 hours if the remediation was an ongoing, monitored process that regulators already knew about. It didn't explain any of it. The document was real. And it was also, in some important way she couldn't fully articulate yet, a trap. I'd like tonight to think about this, Elena said. Gerald studied her. The patience in his face had limits. She could see now fine lines around it, a slight tightening that meant he'd expected the conversation to be over by now. Of course, he said. Tomorrow morning, Elena stood. Across the room, Damon finally looked at her. His face was completely unreadable, not the careful blankness he used as armor, but something actually emptied out, like a room after the furniture's been moved. She looked at him for exactly 1 second, got nothing from it, looked away. She walked to the door. Sismark stepped aside to let her through. She went out into the corridor and walked toward the residential wing, and as soon as she rounded the first corner and was out of line of sight, she stopped, put her back against the wall, and breathed. The cooperation agreement. She pulled out her phone and called her contact, not the federal contact, her colleague, the one whose husband worked in financial crimes, the one she'd used to open the secure channel. It rang 4 times. He picked up. It's me, she said quietly. The transfer cut at 41%. What came through? The sound of him moving, keyboard a pause, transaction records, the entity structure document, the authorization chain for the primary transfers. The ledger photographs didn't make it. Neither did the last 18 files. Is it enough to open something? Another pause. Longer. I sent it up the chain tonight like you asked. I got a response about 20 minutes ago. He stopped. Tell me. Elena, the case reference in the response. There's an existing case. The material you sent was flagged as potentially relevant to an active federal remediation. The cooperation agreement. It was real. But, she said, 'Cause there was a but. She could hear it in the silence before he'd answered. The remediation is what they call a partial disclosure agreement, he said. The entity disclosed the shell company structure. They did not disclose the full extent of the displacement schemes. The property manipulation, the deliberate neighborhood destabilization piece, that's not in the existing case file. That's new. He exhaled. That's significant. Elena pressed herself against the wall. The cooperation agreement was real, and it was also incomplete. Gerald had told half the truth to regulators and contained the other half. The laundering? Yes, that had been disclosed. Penalties negotiated. Remediation structured. But the human element, the communities deliberately destroyed, the families displaced, the businesses killed, the engineering of poverty for profit, that part had been kept out of the agreement. That part was still buried. Her father hadn't just found the money. He'd found the people, and that was what Gerald had needed to stay buried. The 41% that came through, Elena said. Does it include anything on the displacement documentation? 2 files, partial, not complete. Is it enough to extend the existing case? I don't know yet. It's with people who can make that call, not me. He paused. Elena, if someone cut the power to stop this transfer, they know what you have. You need to not be where you are. She was already moving. I know, she said. I'll call you. She ended the call and pushed off the wall and went toward the back stair. She was halfway up the stair when she heard the crash from above. Not a small sound, something falling heavily. The sound of furniture or a body hitting the floor, coming from the direction of the residential wing's north end, the portrait gallery. She took the remaining stairs at a run, no longer caring about sound, and came out into the residential wing corridor and ran toward the north end and hit the gallery door open with her shoulder. Victor was on the floor. Marcus's second man, the one she'd catalogued as the quieter of the two, the one she'd thought was less likely to be a problem, was standing over him, and Victor was trying to get up and not making it, one hand pressed to the side of his head, the portrait of Gerald's grandfather hanging crooked on the wall behind them, the concealed panel door standing open. The metal box was in the second man's hand. Elena went still in the doorway. The man looked at her. He was not Marcus. Marcus was presumably still outside Gerald's study. This was someone Gerald had sent separately, through a different route, because Gerald had known about the portrait gallery. He'd known, not suspected, known. Give me the device, the man said. He meant the prepaid phone. His voice was professional and flat. And the key. Where's the ledger? Elena asked. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. Give me the device. Victor made another attempt to get up. He made it to one knee and stayed there, breathing hard, his hand still at the side of his head, and in the low light from the grounds through the gallery's tall windows, Elena could see dark on his fingers. Blood. Something went cold and clarifying in her chest. Victor. She kept her eyes on the man with the box. How bad? I'm all right, Victor said. It sounded like a decision rather than a fact. The ledger, Elena said again to the man. Is it in the box? He said nothing. The metal box-locked combination protected would take time to open without the combination. If the ledger was still inside it, it was intact. If they'd already gotten it out, she had no way to know where it was. She needed to know which situation she was in. She took a step into the gallery. Stop, the man said. I'm going to help my husband up, Elena said. That's all. Device and key first. I don't have the device on me. She said it without inflection. Not aggressive, not placating. Just flat. It's in my room. It was in her jacket pocket, and she was not giving it to him. The key is in my room, too. I was coming to find Victor, and I heard him fall. She kept moving toward Victor, slow and deliberate. Let me get him up, and I'll take you to my room and give you what you want. 3 feet from Victor, 2 feet. She crouched beside him, put her hand on his arm, and felt him lean into it. The real lean of someone who needed the support, not performance. Can you stand? She said quietly. Yes. He got his feet under him. She pulled, he pushed, and they got him upright, and she could feel the tremor in his arm. Not weakness exactly, more the particular unsteadiness of a person whose body had just taken something unexpected and was still deciding how to process it. The gash at his temple was bleeding steadily but not catastrophically. She pressed her hand against it. He put his hand over hers. The man with the box was watching them, with the patience of someone who had been told to secure the material and would wait as long as necessary to do that without doing anything that would make the situation messier. That patience told her something. He'd been told to contain, not to escalate. Gerald wanted the evidence, not a scene, not in his own house. She filed that. A man who wants to avoid a scene is a man with a limit on what he'll do. All right, she said to the man. Calm, cooperative, buying every second she could. My room is on the south end. I can take you there now. She kept Victor's arm over her shoulders. He needs to come with me. He needs to sit down. The man considered it. He nodded. They walked out of the gallery, Elena, and Victor, her hand still pressed against his temple, his weight partly against her, the man with the box 3 feet behind them, and into the residential corridor. 20 feet down the corridor, a door opened. Damon stepped out. He looked at the three of them, Elena, supporting Victor, blood on Victor's face, the man behind them with the metal box, and his expression went through something that had no single name. What happened? He said. Not a question. The tone of a man who had already formed a theory. Step aside, Mr. Ashbourne, the man behind Elena said. Damon looked at him. He looked at Victor. He looked at Elena. And Elena watched him make a decision, could see the exact moment it happened. The thing in his face resolved into something she hadn't expected and couldn't have predicted from the man who had called her nobody in front of 1,000 people. No, Damon said. The man stopped walking, Mr. Ashbourne. Who gave you the order to put your hands on my uncle? Damon's voice was quiet, quieter than she'd ever heard it. The quiet of something past anger, at the place anger goes when it burns all the way down to the bone. My father doesn't have the authority to order violence against family members in this house. Damon took a step toward the man, then another. He was taller than the man by 3 inches, and the advantage of it was suddenly very present. Give me the box. I have my instructions. I'm giving you new ones. Damon stopped 18 inches from the man and looked at him with the particular expression of a person who has been in charge of things for long enough that authority comes out of his body like a frequency. Give me the box and get out of this wing of the house. A long 5 seconds passed. The man handed over the box. He walked back down the corridor toward the main stair. Damon turned with the metal box in his hands and looked at Elena. His jaw was working. His eyes moved to Victor's bloodied temple, and something tightened in his face. Compressed, stayed compressed. Where do you need to go? He said to Elena. She made the decision fast. The east garden door, Victor's car. Damon nodded. He led the way. They moved through the house. The three of them, Damon first, Elena and Victor behind him, through the back passages, the kitchen corridor, the utility hall, toward the east garden door. No one they passed spoke to them. The few staff they encountered saw Damon's face and found reasons to be elsewhere. The east garden door was unlocked. The night air hit Elena's face, and she breathed it cold, sharp, real. Victor stumbled once on the garden path, and she caught him, and they kept moving toward the east garage. Victor's car was there. He got his keys out somehow. In everything, he'd kept his keys, and Elena got him into the passenger seat and went around to the driver's side and looked back at Damon, who was standing at the garage entrance with the metal box and an expression she didn't have a category for yet. The box, she said. He looked at it. He walked to the car and held it out to her through the open window. She took it. The combination, she said, April 14th. Victor's voice from the passenger seat, faint but precise. Damon frowned. What? Get in, Elena said. I'm not. Damon. She looked at him across the roof of the car. Your father knows I was transmitting. He knows the material exists. He knows Victor was in the portrait gallery. In about 10 minutes, he is going to understand that you helped us leave, and being inside that house when that happens is not in your interest. She held his eyes. Get in the car. 3 seconds. He got in the car. Elena started the engine. She pulled out of the garage and onto the property road and through the estate gate. It opened on Victor's key card, which she found in the center console, and out onto the public road, and she drove, and the lights of Ashbourne House fell away behind them in the rearview mirror. Victor was conscious and breathing, and pressing her jacket against the gash at his temple, which had begun to clot. Damon was in the back seat, saying nothing. The metal box was on the seat between them. Elena drove with both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the road, and the prepaid device in her jacket pocket, with 41% of the evidence already in the hands of a federal contact. 41% plus the ledger in the box, if it was still there. 41% plus Victor's testimony. 41% plus whatever Damon chose to do with what he knew. She didn't know yet if it was enough. She was going to find out. Her phone rang the prepaid device, vibrating against her ribs. She pressed it to her ear one-handed. "It's me," her contact said. "Elena. The 41%, my contact in financial crimes, just called back." They cross-referenced the displacement documentation against the existing remediation file. "And the partial disclosure agreement Gerald signed 2 years ago? The oversight body is pulling it. They're opening a full investigation." He paused. "Elena, they want to talk to you tonight." She exhaled. In the passenger seat, Victor closed his eyes and kept breathing. In the back seat, Damon Ashbourne looked out the window at the road going past, at the city opening up ahead of them, and said nothing. Elena drove toward the lights. "Tell them I'm on my way," she said. The federal field office was in a building that looked like it had been designed to discourage people from thinking about what happened inside it. Gray, mid-century, aggressively unremarkable on a street that nobody drove down unless they had a reason to. Elena pulled into the parking structure at 12:40 in the morning. She turned off the engine and sat for a moment with her hands still on the wheel, feeling the particular stillness that follows sustained motion, the body's delayed recognition that it is allowed to stop. Victor was awake. The bleeding at his temple had slowed to nothing, the clot holding, but the left side of his face had swollen, in a way that would look considerably worse by morning. He had not complained once during the 40-minute drive. She noticed that and filed it alongside the other things she'd learned about Victor Ashbourne in the past 3 weeks, the inventory of a man that turned out to be different from the file she'd built on him before she knew him. Damon had not spoken since they left the estate. She looked at him in the rearview mirror. He was staring at the concrete pillar 6 feet from the car window, the metal box on the seat beside him, his hands loose in his lap. He looked like a person who had been unpacked from a version of himself he'd inhabited for 38 years and hadn't yet figured out what came next. "You don't have to come in," Elena said. He looked at her reflection in the mirror. "What do I do if I don't?" She didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't going to construct one for him. "That's your call," she said. She got out of the car. Victor got out, slower, one hand on the roof for balance. Elena came around and stood close enough that he could use her if he needed to, without making it obvious that she was offering. He didn't take it, but his stride evened out after the first few steps. Behind them, she heard the car door open and close. Damon followed them inside. The agent who met them in the lobby was a woman named Solis, mid-40s, compact, the kind of person whose energy communicated that she had been awake for a long time and fully intended to keep being awake. She looked at the three of them with the practiced assessment of someone who regularly received people in crisis at 1 in the morning and had learned to triage fast. Her eyes went to Victor's face. "Needs to be looked at," she said. "Fine," Victor said. "I wasn't asking." She turned to someone behind her desk. "Can we get medical up here?" It wasn't a question. She looked back at Elena. "You sent the files, 41% of them," Elena said. "The power was cut before the transfer completed." Solis nodded once. "We got enough. And you have the original documentation?" Elena held up the metal box, combination locked. "The combination is April 14. The ledger inside is original handwriting, my father's. Every entry is dated and cross-referenced." Solis looked at the box with the specific attention of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. "Your father was Thomas Vale." "Yes, he was listed as a person of interest in the existing remediation case. His documentation was cited as missing." Solis met Elena's eyes. "We've been trying to locate it for 2 years. The words settled into Elena like stones into water, slow and irreversible. 2 years. They'd been looking for it. Gerald's self-reported remediation had flagged the existence of her father's documentation as a gap, a liability, something the case file referenced but couldn't produce. And Gerald had known that the evidence existed somewhere, that it hadn't been destroyed, that it was the one piece of the architecture he hadn't been able to control, which was why her father's death had never sat right. Not because the evidence would destroy Gerald had already partially managed that with the cooperation agreement, but because the portion of the evidence that covered the displacement schemes, the deliberate human destruction that Gerald had kept out of the disclosure, was in Thomas Vale's documentation and nowhere else. That was what her father had died for, not to protect numbers in a ledger, to protect the names of the neighborhoods, the families, the proof that it wasn't accident or market forces, or the impersonal machinery of development, but deliberate, engineered, Profitable destruction of other people's lives by a man who had signed cooperation agreements and accepted reduced penalties and continued building towers on the cleared ground. "Sit down," Solis said to Elena. Not unkindly, Elena sat. The interview lasted 4 hours. Elena was in a conference room with Solis and 2 other agents who introduced themselves and whose names she immediately lost. She walked them through everything: the gala, Victor's approach, the marriage, the 3 weeks inside Ashbourne House, the portrait gallery, the files, the 41%, the cooperation agreement Gerald had produced. She answered questions the way her father had taught her to answer questions, precisely, without embellishment, without speculation. What she knew, how she knew it, what she'd seen with her own eyes versus what she'd inferred. When she got to the displacement documentation, the deliberate destabilization of the Calloway Street neighborhood and 3 others, she saw something change in Solis's expression. Not surprise exactly. More the expression of a person who has been looking at one face of a thing for 2 years and has just been handed the evidence that confirms what the back of it looks like. Gerald's cooperation agreement covered the Meridian Shell Company structure and the laundering mechanism, Solis said at one point, confirming what Elena's contact had told her in the car. It did not cover the displacement element. His attorneys argued that the property manipulation was market activity aggressive, but legal. We couldn't contradict that without documentation of intent. She looked at the ledger, which was now open on the table between them. Your father documented intent. He was a precise man, Elena said. Yes, Solis said. He was. At 6 in the morning, Solis stood up and said they were done for the night for this morning, and that Elena should get some sleep and come back at noon. She said it the way someone says something when they mean it, and when what comes after noon is going to require the person they're talking to be in a functional state. Elena stood in the corridor outside the conference room and felt the full weight of the night sit down on her all at once. Not dramatically, not in a wave, but in the slow, comprehensive way that exhaustion claims a body when it finally accepts that the emergency is over. Victor was in the medical room 2 floors down. She'd checked on him at the midpoint break. The cut had been properly treated, the swelling was ugly, but there was nothing structural, and he was sitting up and drinking coffee with the expression of a man who was embarrassed about being fussed over. She found Damon in the waiting area near the lobby. He was in the same chair he'd been in when she'd left him 3 hours ago. He might not have moved. His jacket was off, folded on the chair beside him, and he was sitting forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely interlaced, looking at nothing in particular. He looked up when she came in. Elena sat down 2 chairs away from him. Not across the room. She wasn't making a statement. Just 2 chairs. They sat like that for a moment. They talked to me for an hour, Damon said. Earlier. While you were in there. I know. I told them everything you told me tonight. And everything I know about the portfolio restructuring. He paused. I didn't know about the displacement, the neighborhoods. He stopped again, and this time the stop was different. Not choosing words, but sitting with something he couldn't quite get out in the right shape. I signed off on 3 projects in the last 2 years that fed into that structure. I thought they were standard acquisitions. I know, Elena said. Thinking you didn't know doesn't. He started and stopped. No, she agreed. It doesn't. The fluorescent hum of the waiting room filled the space between them. Through the lobby windows, the city was beginning its first pale shift toward morning. Not light yet, but the sky's acknowledgement that light was coming. When we were in the gallery, Elena said carefully, the man who had Victor. You took the box from him and you walked us out. Yes. That was the moment you couldn't unmake. Damon looked at her. I know, your father is going to see it that way too. I know that as well. His jaw moved. He called me 4 times during the interview. I didn't pick up. He looked back at the window. I don't know what I'm going to say to him. You don't have to figure that out tonight. Eventually. Eventually, Elena said, not tonight. He nodded. Slow. The nod of a man accepting a postponement rather than a resolution, which was more honest than any other response would have been. I need to ask you something, Elena said. He looked at her. At the gala, she kept her voice level factual. You called me nobody. In front of a room full of people. In front of everyone who was watching. She held his eyes. I need to know if you understood what you were doing when you did it. He didn't look away, which she gave him credit for. Yes, he said. You knew it would land the way it landed. Yes. She nodded once. Slowly. All right, he started. Stopped. Started again. You're not going to say anything else about it. What else is there to say? She was genuinely asking. Not rhetorically. You did it. You knew what you were doing. It landed. It's over. The question is what kind of person you are now, that you know what kind of person you were then. She looked at him steadily. That's not a question I can answer for you, and it's not one I'm interested in being part of. That's yours. Damon looked at her for a long moment. I thought you'd want an apology, he said. I thought I would too, Elena said. She stood up. Her body ached in the comprehensive way of a body that has spent too many hours running on adrenaline and is now presenting the bill. There's a coffee machine down the hall. It's terrible. Get some sleep when you can. She left him there. Gerald Ashbourne was arrested at Ashbourne House at 8:47 in the morning. Elena was not there to see it. She was in a hotel 2 miles from the federal building, in a room she'd booked at 6:15, and she was asleep when her phone rang with a notification from Solis. She read this message. She put the phone face down on the nightstand. She went back to sleep. She didn't wake up until afternoon. The legal proceedings that followed took 8 months. Elena did not track them in real time. She had given everything she had to the investigators, every file, the ledger, the partial transfer, her testimony. What the federal system did with it from that point was the federal system's job, not hers. Solis called her when she needed something. Elena provided it. The rest of the time she went back to her work, her real work, which had been sitting in a state of suspended animation for 3 weeks while she did the thing that needed doing. Gerald's cooperation agreement was revoked within the first 30 days. The displacement element, the deliberate engineering of community destruction across 4 neighborhoods, documented in Thomas Vale's handwriting across 40 pages of ledger and 63 digital files, could not be contained within the original agreement's scope. His attorney spent 3 months arguing otherwise. The evidence was too specific, too dated, too precise. Her father had been a meticulous man. Gerald was ultimately charged on 12 counts, including wire fraud, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, and 3 counts relating directly to the displacement schemes. 2 of his senior executives took plea deals and provided additional testimony that closed the remaining gaps in the case. Victor cooperated fully. His attorneys presented the coercion documentation, the leverage Gerald had held over him, the circumstances of the first authorization, and negotiated an arrangement that included significant financial penalties, mandatory cooperation, and a 3-year monitored probationary period. He did not go to prison. Elena did not have an opinion about whether that was fair. It was what it was, and Victor had spent the last 4 years trying to do one right thing, which didn't erase the years before it, but also wasn't nothing. He transferred the legitimate Ashbourne Foundation assets into the independent trust, exactly as he'd told Elena he planned to. The trust was structured so that no single Ashbourne family member could control it. Its mandate was the restoration and redevelopment of the 4 communities the Meridian operations had damaged. Damon resigned from the Ashbourne group the day after the arrest. He spent the following 2 months, according to the brief, factual updates that reached Elena, through Victor doing nothing in particular. Not publicly, anyway. She didn't ask for more detail than that, and Victor understood without being told that she wasn't asking. At month 3, Damon contacted the trust's newly formed board and asked to be considered for a staff position. Not a leadership role. A staff position, project coordination, community liaison work, the kind of work where you answered to other people and built trust one task at a time. The board discussed it. Victor abstained from the vote. The board voted to offer him a probationary position, which he accepted. Elena found out about it in a phone call from the trust administrator, who wanted to know if she had any objection. She said she didn't. She meant it. The Callaway Street project broke ground in the spring. Not the Ashbourne Group's luxury towers. Those permits had been frozen and ultimately revoked during the investigation. Elena's counter-proposal, the one she'd spent 3 years building, and submitted through every proper channel and carried to a gala where it had been dismissed in front of a room full of people. That proposal, revised and expanded, was the one the city approved. The trust provided the financing. Elena's firm led the design. The community stakeholders, the residents who had signed 311 names onto a petition, who had been given 4 minutes at a microphone before being cut off, were at every planning meeting. It was not smooth. Designed by committee rarely is, and designed by community is even less so. There were disagreements about density and height, and what businesses should anchor the commercial space, and whether the community arts center should have a proper performance stage, or whether that money should go to additional housing units. Elena facilitated those arguments, took notes, revised the plan 6 times, argued back when she thought the committee was wrong, and lost 3 of those arguments and adjusted accordingly. It took 11 months from groundbreaking to first occupancy. The affordable housing units were fully leased before the building was finished. The small business spaces had a wait list. The community arts center. They built the performance stage. The vote went 4-3, and Elena had been one of the 3, but she implemented the winning decision without dragging her feet about it. Opened on a Saturday in October, with a program that ran 6 hours, in which Elena attended for the first 2. Before slipping out because there was a site review at the next block first thing Sunday morning. She was not a person who lingered at her own openings. Her mother came up from Phoenix for the opening weekend. She walked the building with Elena on the Sunday morning after the program, in the early quiet, before the site review, the 2 of them moving through rooms that smelled of fresh paint and new wood and the particular atmospheric warmth of a space that had been built for people and was already beginning to feel like it. Her mother stopped in the main hallway and looked up at the ceiling high, open, with the exposed beam structure Elena had fought to keep because the community stakeholders had wanted it, and she'd agreed with them. "Your father would have liked this," her mother said. Elena looked up at the ceiling too. "I know," she said. They stood there for a moment. Her mother reached over and took her hand. Elena let her. The opening ceremony was on a Friday in November. Victor sat in the front row with his jaw fully healed and his suit without a tie, and the specific expression of a man who is watching something he helped make possible and is not claiming credit for it. Elena found him afterward, when the crowd had thinned and the speeches were done and the catering staff were breaking down the tables. "How does it feel?" he asked. She looked around at the space, the community arts center lobby, full of people who belong there by right rather than by invitation, talking and laughing and taking photographs of the river view through the tall windows. "Like something that should have happened a long time ago," she said. Victor nodded. "Yes," he paused. "I'm sorry it took." Victor. She said it the way she'd said it that first night in the restaurant, when he'd been about to apologize for being afraid, and she'd understood that the apology wasn't what the situation needed. It happened. That's enough. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded again, and this time the nod landed differently. The nod of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has been told by someone with the authority to say it that he can set it down. He set it down. She watched him do it. Damon found her near the end of the evening, when most of the guests had left, and the crew was packing up the last of the equipment, and the center was settling into the first quiet of its operational life. He was in a jacket without a tie. She had a brief sideways, thought that he'd picked that up from Victor, and he looked like a person who had been through a significant reorganization of himself and was still in the middle of it, but was learning to function in the meantime. Less polished than the man at the gala, more present. "It's a good building," he said. "Thank you." They stood near the window that overlooked the river. The water was dark and moving, and the lights of the bank sat on its surface in long, smeared lines. "I've been doing the community liaison work for 4 months," he said. "Going into the neighborhoods that were affected, meeting with the families, explaining the Trust's restoration program." He paused. "It's harder than I expected. Why did you expect it to be easy?" He almost smiled. "I expected it to be hard. I just didn't know what kind of hard." He looked at the river. "Some of those families, the ones the Meridian acquisitions displaced, they've been scattered for years. Some of them can't come back. The neighborhood they knew doesn't exist anymore, even if the buildings are here." He was quiet for a moment. "There's no fixing that. The Trust can do a lot. But that specific thing, the community that was, you can't rebuild what dispersal takes apart." "No," Elena said, "you can't. So what do you do?" She thought about it, genuinely, not because she had an answer prepared, but because the question deserved real thought. "You build something that acknowledges what was lost," she said finally. "And you make sure the people who are here now have what they need. And you don't pretend that any of that makes it even." Damon nodded slowly. "The people I talk to, they know it doesn't make it even. They know what the trust is and what the restoration program is, and they show up to the meetings anyway. He paused. I think they show up because someone is finally actually there. Not sending representatives. Not holding public hearings with 4-minute windows. He looked at her briefly. Actually there. That's the job, Elena said. Yeah. He breathed out. It is. The silence between them was different from every silence they'd shared before. Not loaded, not strategic, not the silence of two people maneuvering around each other. Just two people standing near a window at the end of a long day, in a building that had been built against the odds, watching the river. At the gala, Damon said, Elena waited. I told you that you didn't belong. That people like you. He stopped. I want you to know that I've thought about why I said that. Not just that I was wrong, but why. Because being wrong is, you can be wrong and not understand it, and just decide not to do that thing again. He looked at the river. I said it because you made me uncomfortable. Because you were better than what I wanted you to be, and I didn't have a category for that. Someone who didn't need what I had to offer, who wasn't impressed, who was just there doing the work, not asking my permission to matter. He paused. That's not an excuse. I just wanted you to know I understand it now. Elena looked at him. At the profile of his face in the window light, which was different from the face he'd worn at the gala, heavier in some places, lighter in others. The face of a person who had been through something. Being called nobody wasn't what broke me, she said. He turned to look at her. What broke me was that for a moment, just a moment, I believed it was possible that you were right. Not about me specifically, about the system. About the idea that belonging is something given by people who already have it. She held his gaze. That's the thing that actually costs you, not what someone says. The second when you consider whether they might be correct. And now, he said. Now I know better, she said simply. That's all. I just know better. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked back at the river. I think I'm starting to, he said. She thought that was probably true. She thought it would take time, and that some days would be worse than others, and that the work he was doing in those neighborhoods was the right kind of work for someone trying to understand the actual texture of what had been done. And that understanding the texture was the prerequisite for doing anything real about it. She didn't say any of that. She didn't need to. Go home, she said. It's late. He almost smiled again, the same almost like a habit he was still building. Good night, Elena. Good night, Damon. He walked toward the exit. She watched him go, and then she looked back at the river. And she stayed there for a few minutes more, just herself and the window and the water and the building around her that smelled like fresh paint and possibility, and the specific kind of new that comes after something old has been. Cleared away properly, at cost, without shortcuts. She thought about her father, not the way she usually thought about him, the grief shape of him, the absence, but the actual man. The way he made coffee in the morning, standing over the machine like it owed him something. The way he explained things, not talking down but leaning in, as if the information was something they were discovering together. The particular steadiness of his voice when things were difficult, which had made her think for years that he was simply not afraid of things, and which she now understood had been something else, not the absence of fear, but the decision to act anyway, every day, in the face of whatever the day brought. He had been afraid, she understood now. He had been afraid, and he had kept going. She had been afraid too, in the garden with the key in her hand and Gerald's house around her, in the portrait gallery with the note, in the car driving toward the federal building at 1 a.m. with a 61-year-old man bleeding quietly in the passenger seat and a man she'd once considered an enemy in the back. She had been afraid and she had kept going. That was what he had left her. Not the key, not the evidence, not the case file or the ledger, or the documentation that had brought down a man who had believed his money made him permanent. Just the understanding that afraid and moving are not mutually exclusive. That you could carry fear the way you carry a coat in warm weather, aware of it. Not using it, but not throwing it away either, because weather changes. She picked up her bag from where she'd left it against the wall. She walked through the community arts center one last time, through the lobby, past the performance space with its stage and its proper rigging that she had voted against and been glad was overruled, through the corridor with the community gallery wall, where the first exhibition was already up, photographs of the neighborhood as it had been and as it was now, and the careful, honest gap between those two things. She pushed through the exterior door. The night was cold and clear in the particular way. November nights are cold and clear in this city. The kind of cold that is genuinely cold, not theatrical about it, just actual temperature doing what it does. She stood on the front steps of the building she had built and looked at the neighborhood that surrounded it. The lights and windows, the storefronts with their new signage, the community gardens along the riverfront path that the residents had demanded and gotten and were already tending. Nobody had given her this. She had not waited for permission. She had not needed the Ashbourne name or the Ashbourne money or the Ashbourne anything except the access that came with, carrying her father's key through the right door at the right time. And she had used that access for exactly as long as she needed it, and then she had built something that belonged to the people who lived here and would go on belonging to them long after every Ashbourne alive today was nothing but a name on a legal filing in a federal archive. Elena Vale stood on the front steps of the building that bore her father's name and felt the cold air move across her face and thought about nobody, about what it meant to be called that, about what it cost, about the fact that it had cost her something and that the cost was real and that you didn't get to just decide it hadn't happened because the ending was good. It had happened. She had been called nobody by a man with everything, in front of everyone, and it had landed. And she had walked out of that room and done what she always did with things that landed hard. She had worked. She had built. She had kept going. And now she was standing in front of something real, something that would shelter actual people against actual weather, something that would give actual children a place to make things, and actual families a place to gather, and actual small businesses a place to exist without being engineered out of the neighborhood by the financial machinery of men who had never once counted the human cost of their decisions. She was not a triumphant person by nature. She did not feel triumphant now. She felt tired in the way that is actually satisfaction, the tiredness of a body that has done the thing it was built to do. She felt something that was the opposite of nobody. She couldn't name it exactly. That was fine. Some things don't need names to be real. She walked down the steps, turned up her collar against the cold, and went home.